Okay, I think we can get started now. My name is Ralph McInerney, and I'm chairing this session. And what I intend to do, first of all, is introduce the members of our panel, and then they will give their presentations seriatim, after which we will open the floor for discussion and comment. Professor Katherine Tillman, now emerita, was a member of the program of liberal studies here at Notre Dame for a good many years, and also worked in the administration, but she repented and returned to teaching after that. Her research moved very gradually, I think, into Newman, and then became dominated by work on Newman. She edited and wrote a very interesting introduction to the Oxford University sermons of Newman, and published a collection of his lesser-known pieces on the university. Phillip Sloan, also in the program of liberal studies, brings particularly interesting background to this discussion. He's been the director of that program on a number of occasions, but also here at the university, he directed for a time the program in the history and philosophy of science. His background, advanced degrees both in science and in philosophy. He is currently involved in a review and study of liberal education with people from St. John's in Annapolis and St. Mary's College in Moraga, California. Father Marvin O'Connell is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Notre Dame. He was chair of that department for some 2 terms. His writing is what I would like particularly to draw your attention to. He wrote his dissertation here at Notre Dame working with Monsignor Phillip, the eminent church historian. And his dissertation on Thomas Stapleton was his first published book. Since then, there has been a veritable stream of publications, a marvelous book on the Oxford movement, the Oxford conspirators. He's done a number of biographies, one of Archbishop Ireland of St. Paul. Father is a priest of the Archdiocese of St. Paul. And most recently, after books on modernism and on Pascal, he published a life of Father Edward Sorin, the founder of this university, which electrified the campus and acquainted many members of the congregation with the history that had been relatively unknown to them. So what we're going to do now, having introduced our panel, they are going to, as I say, seriatim present their papers in this order: Father O'Connell first, Professor Tillman second, and Professor Sloan third. So Father O'Connell.
I thought I'd start by singing "You Don't Know the Troubles I've Seen." How's that? I first knew Dr. Cullen at Rome in 1847. John Henry Newman wrote long after the events, when he was very civil to me. After he came to Ireland as Archbishop of Armagh, he showed his recollection of me by asking me to preach in the summer of 1850 at the dedication of a church in his diocese. This invitation Newman had to decline, but when a university was to be founded for Catholics in Ireland, he wrote to consult me on the subject. On April 15th, 1851, now what? Do I start over?
See if that's
okay. On April 15th, now quoting Newman, on April 15th, 1851, he wrote to ask me to advise on the best way of setting about it, and invited me to deliver a set of lectures in Dublin against mixed education. he called on me in Birmingham in July of that year. The upshot was that at the end of 1851, Newman accepted an appointment as rector of the new university, and the following spring, he delivered the memorable lectures Cullen had asked for in the rotunda on O'Connell Street, the discourses that form the opening section of the idea of a university. For Newman, this turn of events seemed to present a providential opportunity to contribute significantly to the Catholic Church, which, at great personal and professional sacrifice, he had joined in 1845. After all, he had been for years the leading figure at Oxford, and it had been his conversion to Catholicism that had cost him his position in that most eminent university. Nor did he doubt that he possessed the capacity to oversee an institution that would serve Catholics not only in Ireland, but across the English-speaking world. Education, he observed in a later autobiographical note, has been my line. And so he counted himself prepared to aim at improving the condition, the status of the Catholic body by a careful survey of their argumentative basis, of their position relatively to the philosophy and character of the day, by giving them juster views, by enlarging and refining their minds. In one word, by education. Now, from first to last, education in this large sense of the word has been my line. So Newman was ready to face the challenge in Ireland. But was Ireland ready for him? One need not dwell on the long and unhappy record of England's oppression against its sister island. Perfidious Albion indeed in this instance. One need only invoke the names of Henry VIII and the Earl of Essex, of the brutal Cromwell and William III, or call to the memory the massacre of Drogheda and the Battle of the Boyne. In 1800, a more or less enlightened British government attempted a measure of alleviation by abolishing its puppet regime in Dublin and instituting a new entity called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, in the Parliament of which the Irish were granted nominal representation. But this political maneuver did little to soften the grinding poverty, which appeared to be the only birthright of most of the Irish, nor the officious contempt for their religion and for their Celtic race. The resulting restlessness was a continuing worry to successive British governments. Indeed, the threat of revolution in Ireland had led in 1829 to an act of Parliament which secured for Catholics, at least in theory, most civil rights. Another bone of contention was the fact that 80% of Irishmen were barred from higher education. In 1845, the government in London proposed as a solution to set up 3 non-denominational colleges in Cork, Belfast, and Galway to serve the needs of those who were prevented by reason of their religion from attending the only university in Ireland, the staunchly Anglican Trinity College, Dublin. Eventually, these so-called Queen's colleges would coalesce to form a national university. The proposal made rough political sense as a gesture to the Catholics and to the scattering of Presbyterians across the Northeast, but philosophically, it challenged the traditional view that a university, for its integrity's sake, must have theology as an essential element in its curriculum and constitution. The 27 Irish bishops differed sharply as to what stance to take. The majority dismissed the scheme of the godless colleges, but several of the more prominent prelates believed that some accommodation with the government could and should be reached. Both sides took their case to Rome, where, after the long deliberation characteristic of the Vatican bureaucracy, the Queen's colleges were declared out of bounds for Catholics. The 2 most influential members of the hierarchy approved of this decision. John MacHale, Archbishop of Tuam, the Lion of the West, as he was admiringly called by his co-religionists, because he abominated almost to the point of violence any idea like mixed education that emanated from England. and Paul Cullen, Archbishop of Armagh and later of Dublin, because he was desirous of founding an institution as exclusively Catholic as Trinity was Protestant. It was Cullen, the man who had been civil to Newman in Rome in 1847, who at a national synod persuaded his reluctant fellow bishops to approve the establishment of a Catholic university. And of course, it was Cullen who recruited Newman to be its head. The great irony at work here was that the man who strove hardest to open higher education to Irish Catholics was also the man who did most to frustrate the project. Partly, this was a matter of style. Cullen had left his native county Kildare at 17 and spent the next 30 years in Rome as student, teacher, and rector of the Irish seminary there. A strong and articulate ultramontane, he was a favorite of Popes Gregory XVI and Pius IX. There followed a natural propensity for him to adopt the administrative procedures of the Roman Curia, at once secretive, authoritarian, and loath to commit anything to paper. Back in Ireland, this methodology proved a heavy cross for Newman to bear once he had assumed the rectorship of the university. Cullen's chronic secretiveness and procrastination were maddening. Literally, months would pass, and Newman would receive no reply to communications on matters of pressing concern he had dispatched to Archbishop's house. Of course, he recorded bitterly years later, I resented Dr. Cullen. I could not act because I could not get him to say yes or no to questions which I asked him. And if I acted without asking, then I displeased him. But more than style was involved here. In fairness, it must be said that Paul Cullen was ever the priest. His ultramontanism had little to do with politics and everything to do with introducing into Ireland a sacramental, devotional, and disciplinary regularity, which task he regarded as his first duty. And according to his lights, he succeeded brilliantly. The remarkable conformity that characterized the post-famine Irish church until recently, and is notably lacking before that calamitous event as it is today, has been justly dubbed by historians the Cullenization of Irish Catholicism. But Cullen's priestly aspirations miscarried badly when confronted with the issue of higher education. Indeed, the Archbishop never wanted a real university. He wanted a mechanism to control the unruly Irish laity who, in his view, needed constant clerical supervision. When Newman recommended that prominent laymen serve on the university's finance board, Cullen refused, knowing full well that he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so the budget was left to depend upon an annual collection taken up in the parishes from poor people without a hope of a university education, and thus controlled by the clerical chancery office. The laymen, for their part, specifically the lawyers, other professionals, and the small number of country gentlemen, Irish Catholics of influence, in other words, hesitated to associate themselves with an institution so under the sway of the clergy. One other circumstance must be mentioned, if only in passing, although in itself it was the most important event that shaped the Ireland in which the Catholic University was founded. In 1845, the year Newman became a Catholic, and Prime Minister Peel sponsored the scheme of the Queen's Colleges, blight ruined much of the potato crop. Over the 3 years that followed, unhappy Ireland was plunged into unprecedented catastrophe. During the famine, 1 million died of hunger and disease, and 1 million more were maimed or disabled. The literature abounds with descriptions of the horrors of that time, which almost beggar the imagination. But let the demographic statistics, in their dry way, tell the story. Before the famine, the population of Ireland was nearly 8 million. The figure today, including the Republic and the 6 northeast counties still part of the United Kingdom, stands at a little more than 4 million. No other country in the Western world has experienced a decline in population since the mid-19th century. The numbers living in Britain, by contrast, increased by 400% over the same time span. Nobody knows the troubles I've seen. Can you separate that for me? I want both. Such were some of the vicissitudes which Newman had to contend when he embarked on what he called my campaign in Ireland. He arrived there for the first time at the age of 50, a Victorian gentleman to his fingertips who knew nothing of the place, or rather, who knew of it, as he might have said, notionally and not really. Ultimately, he had to contend with a suspicious, unattractive, and uncooperative superior in Cullen, with a hierarchy at best unenthusiastic. The Bishop of Cork greeted me with civility to my person, but with cold indifference to the project that had brought me to Ireland. And at worst hostile, John MacHale, the old lion, soon decided that Newman was an agent of predictable English malevolence. And most difficult of all, he had to work in a land ravaged by hunger and disease and ancient animosities. Nevertheless, Newman stayed the course. He crossed the Irish Sea by his own count on 56 occasions between 1851 and 1858, sick every time. And during his tenure as rector of the Catholic University of Ireland, he left behind not only a literary and philosophical testament with which any discussion of higher education, even after a century and a half, must still begin, but also, under the most difficult circumstances, a record of shrewd and enlightened administration of which any university president could be proud. From first to last, education in this large sense of the word has been my line. Indeed. Thank you.
Having successfully delivered the Dublin discourses that would begin his classic work, The Idea of a University, Newman went back to England, a rector, that is a president, without a university. For 2.5 years, he awaited final approval of the university's opening, enduring delay after delay, particularly at the hands of Archbishop Cullen. One of the bishops, sympathetic to Newman, wrote in a letter to him that Cullen had found a splendid horse to do his work against the Queen's colleges, but now he began to regard it as a Pegasus with wings and beyond his control. He saw fire coming from its nostrils, and while its feet nervously pawed the ground, Cullen stood by in dread of some new and unexpected flight into a medium beyond his reach and understanding. At last, early in 1854, full authorization came in the form of a papal brief. Newman quotes in his university memorandum some of the passages from the brief, inserting his own emphases and a running commentary. The bishops, he writes, as founders of the university, are exhorted in the letter to make, quote, our divine religion the soul, anima, of the entire scholarly enterprise. That is, Newman adds, the form. All of the disciplines, Newman continues quoting, are to go forward in the most strict league with religion. That is, comments Newman, with the assumption of Catholic doctrine in their intrinsic treatment. And the professors are directly to mold with all their strength the youth to piety and virtue. Without even a pause or a new paragraph, Newman, who is said to have thought that Archbishop Cullen practically wrote the brief, such was Cullen's influence in Rome, Newman bluntly addends the following. I wrote on a different idea, my discourses on university education. The different idea upon which Newman had based his discourses, by now long published for everyone, including Cullen, to have read, was the idea of a university in its sheer essence, qua university. He called it the bare and necessary idea of a university, abstracting it, for the discourses only, from any historical or practical consideration, it being a kind of ideal type rather than the intended description of a single entity. The essential aim within the bare idea university, Newman argues, is not religious education, as Cullen mistakenly thought, nor is it the advancement of knowledge, as professional societies rightly promote among their memberships. The idea university does not include training for a profession, not even for the priestly profession, nor is its aim knowledge by bulk, as Newman called the shallow possession of a smattering of facts in a dozen branches of study. Nor does his idea envision the reading of only Catholic literature, as insisted upon in the brief. Proscribe secular literature as such, Newman writes, and its manifestations are waiting for your pupils' benefit at the very doors of your lecture room in living and breathing substance. You have refused him the masters of human thought, who would in some sense have educated him because of their incidental corruption. You have shut up from him those whose thoughts strike home to our hearts, whose words are proverbs, whose names are indigenous to all the world, who are the standards of the mother tongue and the pride and boast of their countrymen, because the old Adam smelt rank in them. It is not the way to learn to swim in troubled waters, never to have gone into them. Rather, the purpose of university education, according to Newman, is solely the cultivation of a healthy mind through delight in knowledge for its own sake, not for any other reason or objective. Newman quotes Aristotle in this as in so many other matters. Of possessions, those rather are useful which bear fruit, those liberal which tend to joy in the truth, which tend to enjoyment. All branches of knowledge are connected because the subject matter of knowledge is intimately united in itself as being the acts and the work of the Creator. So the various disciplines into which our knowledge may be said to be cast have multiple bearings on one another. They admit, or rather demand, comparison and adjustment. They complete, correct, and balance each other. To give undue prominence to one is to be unjust to another. To omit one is to distort the others. Writes Newman, there is no science but tells a different tale when viewed as a portion of a whole from what it is likely to suggest when taken by itself, without the safeguard, as I may call it, of others. In his first three discourses of the idea, Newman argues that the intellectual subject matter of theology is knowledge, and its object is truth. Therefore, any university worthy of the name must include it. If theology were to disappear, for example, then psychology, anthropology, the natural sciences, even politics might exceed their boundaries, dividing up and usurping the territory proper to theology alone. Philosophy, in Newman's sense, the science of sciences, comprehends the location, limitation, rank, and bearing of each of the disciplines, including theology, as they relate to the others and to the whole of knowledge. The true goal of liberal education, so often forgotten or ignored, is the cultivation in university students of a broad, far-reaching, and lasting mental disposition, in just this sense of enabling them to map the universe. That is, to penetrate and understand the relative disposition of things. The liberally educated individual, says Newman, apprehends the great outlines of knowledge, the principles on which it rests, the scale of its parts, its great points and its little, as he otherwise cannot apprehend them. Hence it is that education is called liberal. A habit of mind is formed which lasts through life, of which the attributes are freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation, and wisdom. Or what in a former discourse I have ventured to call a philosophical habit. In order to develop the intellect's innate powers, the student, according to Newman, must resolutely practice what he calls the habit of method, thus steering clear of superficial viewiness, which Newman excoriates. I hold very strongly that the first step in intellectual training is to impress upon a student's mind the idea of science, method, order, principle, and system, of rule and exception, of richness and harmony, to stimulate his powers into action in every practicable way. Let him once gain this habit of method, of starting from fixed points, of making his ground good as he goes, of distinguishing what he knows from what he does not know, and I conceive he will be gradually introduced into the largest and truest philosophical views, and will feel nothing but impatience and disgust at the random theories and imposing sophistries and dashing paradoxes which carry away half-formed and superficial intellects. The living mind of the student must thus impregnate knowledge by thought, Newman writes, so that it is truly appropriated and made a personal possession. This intellectual enlargement consists, quote, in the mind's energetic and simultaneous action upon and toward and among these new ideas which are rushing in upon it. It is the action of a formative power, reducing to order and meaning the manner of our acquirements. We feel our minds to be growing and expanding then, when we not only learn, but refer what we learn to what we know already. It is not the mere addition to our knowledge, that is the illumination, but the locomotion, the movement onwards of that mental center to which both what we know and what we are learning, the accumulating mass of our acquirements, gravitates, end quote. The happy side effect in the student of a good liberal education is his becoming what Newman has famously called the gentleman, the one who never inflicts pain. University training, he says, gives a person a clear, conscious view of his own opinions and judgments, a truth in developing them, an eloquence in expressing them, and a force in urging them. It prepares him to fill any post with credit, and to master and subject with facility, to master any subject with facility. He has the repose of a mind which lives in itself while it lives in the world. He has a gift which serves him in public and supports him in retirement. This compelling view of the educated gentleman is often, quite mistakenly, taken to be Newman's pedagogical ideal. Not so. Knowledge is one thing, Newman writes. Virtue is another. Good sense is not conscience. Refinement is not humility. Nor is largeness and justness of view faith. Liberal education makes not the Christian, not the Catholic, but the gentleman. Quarry the granite rock with razors, or moor the vessel with a thread of silk. Then may you hope with such keen and delicate instruments as human knowledge and human reason to contend against those giants, the passion and the pride of man. Up to now, we have been considering the bare and necessary idea, university. That is, university in its essential nature. What then for Newman makes a university Catholic? Catholicism contributes to the university's integrity. That is, to its well-being, its sustenance, and its wholeness. So do other things, such as research, publication, and the professional engagement of its faculty, such as graduate and professional schools, such as its libraries, observatories, theaters, and museums, and maybe even its sports. Newman borrows for the university an analogy that Aristotle used for the state, distinguishing between a thing's essence and its full flourishing or integrity. The essence, the definition or idea of a human being, say, does not include the air we breathe and the water we drink. But these life-sustaining elements are necessary for the integrity, the fullness of activity of a complete human life. Just so, Newman is arguing, the church breathes its unearthly life into the university, bestowing sustenance and grace for the full flourishing of the human spirit. Through personal influence, through diligent discipline, through residential and community life, through liturgies, ceremonies, and the celebrations of its traditions, education goes beyond the bare idea of intellectual cultivation and gives nourishment to the student's life of Catholic faith and virtue. The professorial system fulfills the strict idea of a university and is sufficient for its being, Newman writes, but it is not sufficient for its well-being. Colleges constitute the integrity of the university. In Newman's little-known second volume on university education, namely, Rise and Progress of Universities, we read that the primary locus of the university's integrity is the colleges, that is, the residence halls, where the tutors exercise what Newman was committed to as a pastoral duty, mentoring students individually for their academic flourishing and also for the development of their moral and religious life. The near and far-reaching power of personal influence, together with its necessary check and ally, discipline, must be conjoined and balanced, Newman says. The intellect which Athens-like is noble, critical, proud, and free is by nature bound to conscience, which Rome-like knows duty and devotion, sanction and rule. Without the formation and maturation of conscience, the cultivated intellect easily becomes bloated with pride, substituting brilliance or legality or expedience for the gentle promptings within the deep heart's core. The happiness of the liberally educated gentleman would only increase, writes Newman, were it not for the memento within him that books and gardens do not make a man immortal. The university principle, then, is expansive personal influence, whereas the college principle is concentrated discipline. The former defines, the latter completes. In Newman's words, a university embodies the principle of progress, and a college that of stability. The one is the sail and the other the ballast. Each is insufficient in itself for the pursuit, the extension, and inculcation of knowledge. Each is useful to the other. A university is the scene of enthusiasm, of pleasurable exertion, of brilliant display. And a college is the scene of order, of conscientious fulfillment of duty, of mutual private services, and deep and lasting attachments. It would seem as if a university seated and living in colleges would be a perfect institution as possessing excellence of opposite kinds. But such a union Newman concludes, such salutary balance and mutual complement of opposite advantages is of difficult and rare attainment. I should like to conclude with some brief reflections on Newman's educational thought. First, I see his most remarkable insight and contribution to educational theory to be his brilliant depiction of the developing human mind as it gradually acquires a philosophical habit of mind. Through liberal education, a living and active intelligence grows and deepens and energizes toward its own unique perfection, the development of which Newman calls a sacred duty. Secondly, I am convinced that consideration of the idea of a university alone is insufficient for an understanding of Newman's educational views. Therein he presents atypically a type, a somewhat static idea of a university, removed from history and its own development, which is not at all his usual way of conceiving things. Thus, taking into account his second volume on university education, Rise and Progress of Universities, is essential for understanding Newman's philosophy of education. And thirdly, I think that Newman's educational view of the ideally balanced relation between the essence and the integrity of the university, between its intellectual and its religious life, between the professorial principle and the tutorial principle, between influence and discipline, while a most attractive schema leaves dualities greater than he himself might ultimately wish. I say this because in his early Oxford University sermons and in his late essay in aid of a grammar of assent, Newman sees the relation of reason and faith to be much more intimately united, as the Catholics of his England and of his Ireland certainly experienced in their everyday lives. What might it mean today if Catholic educators were really to believe and act upon Newman's words that faith is the reasoning of the religious mind? Thank you.
My charge on this was to somehow interface some of Newman's views with much more contemporary questions. So I'm going to try not so much do a historical analysis here as I'm going to try to bring this up to the questions that maybe are facing us right today. And I begin this by relating an experience that began with the previous Fall Ethics and Culture Conference. This was a few years ago, centered on the encyclical Evangelicum Vitae. The topic was to develop insights that stemmed from the Pope's defense of life. It included, as this one does, theologians, philosophers, historians, ethicists, and humanists of many forms from a variety of Catholic and even some non-Catholic institutions. The discussions were rich and informative. A week later, I attended a conference devoted to the topic Braving the New World at the University of Michigan. In this conference were biomedical scientists, physicians, biophysicists, some philosophers, and another form of bioethicists. The discussions were also rich and informative. The problem was that I felt that I had moved to a different planet. Here were presentations that urged us to move ahead with a broad agenda into the future that was to apply the Human Genome Project, stem cell research, cloning, and the rational control of life, both to cure human ailments and also explicitly to reshape human nature in view of this new biological power. One major difference was that it was this latter conference and not the former that one felt that the money, the big grants, and most of the technical power lay. Since this experience, I've been concerned more than I had been previously to see where the interface was to be found between the Catholic University and modern academia, and specifically with that form of academia, the biomedical world, that threatens certain traditional Catholic values, not simply with secularism, but with post-Baconian secularism in which knowledge has become technical power, power over nature, power over the environment, power over life itself. What can John Henry Newman say to us about this interface? This is the topic of these brief remarks. Now, Newman, as is well known, was writing against the backdrop of three models of the university that were in deep struggle in his later years. There was the residential Oxford College system based in large measure on reading the classics and with a distinct religious, in that case Anglican, atmosphere. The second was the new utilitarian university, illustrated particularly by University College London, often the direct or indirect target of some of the comments in the idea. It was formed on the inspiration of Bentham, whose stuffed body still sits in the main lobby, for those of you who've not visited it. It was based on the cultivation of useful knowledge, economics, medicine, political economy, science, and engineering, from which religious study and theology were formally excluded. The third was a German research university, emphasizing the PhD in graduate school and graduate institute research, that was slowly entering the British context. One can see in Newman's idea a concern to deal with these three challenges and to affirm in many respects, and I think Professor Tillman has just illustrated this, the college model in a new Catholic form in relation to a new conception of the university. Now, Phillip Gleason last evening outlined for us the development of the American Catholic University that took place under a different set of circumstances. With some of these trends that are interacting, that I've spoken of, were also interacting here. And we saw from his historical narrative how the relations between the Catholic College and the university surrounding culture played out in four different historical eras, with us now living in the wake, and I thought this is a beautiful metaphor, the perfect storm that developed in the 1960s. It's now our task at the Catholic University to think about what it is in the era where we must interface with the drive to research and specialization and with the technological power that is being developed by the major research universities, which in the developments in the biomedical sciences illustrate most immediately are tremendously powered. And we have to do this without the aid of a single organizing educational philosophy or philosophical system that is any longer clearly intact. Now, I begin with the assumption that the Catholic University must be and remain at its core committed to liberal education in more than a disciplinary sense of a school that pursues specialized research in various humanistic disciplines. In other words, it also seems necessary for it to pursue general liberal education, and particularly the kind of broad liberal education that I see Newman advocating in such texts as Discourse 5 of the Idea, and that was, as Professor Tillman indicated, added to this an additional Catholic and theological dimension. But how is this possible in the current climate in higher education if we are also to participate in this larger research agenda? I take as a point of departure the Ernest L. Boyer Commission report that was entitled Educating Undergraduates in a Research University, commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation in 1995. And this is available on the web if anybody wants to look it up. This report, widely cited at Notre Dame in recent years, calls for a new model for undergraduate education, especially at universities that consider themselves in the research university category. This report advocates an undergraduate education based on, quote, dynamic inquiry. And to quote this report directly, the ideal embodied in the report would turn the prevailing undergraduate culture of receivers into a culture of inquirers, a culture in which faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates share an adventure of discovery, unquote. As we read this in more detail, however, this culture of inquiry at the undergraduate level has a very specific definition. It means that undergraduates are to be introduced into the educational model of the graduate school. I quote the report again. The basic idea of learning as inquiry is the same as the idea of research. Even though advanced research occurs at advanced levels, undergraduates beginning in the freshman year can learn through research in the humanities. Emphasize this. Undergraduates should have the opportunity to work in primary materials, perhaps linked to their professors' research projects. As undergraduates advance through their program, their learning experiences become closer and closer to that of the graduate student. By the senior year, the able undergraduate should be ready for research of the same character and approximately the same complexity as the first-year graduate student. Now, I have several comments to make on these proposals. One of these grows from my own autobiographical experience. I was first educated as a scientist exclusively in the research and technical model. My undergraduate degree was in zoology with a minor in chemistry. Looking back from this perspective, many of the changes the Boyer Report advises in undergraduate education would be a welcome reform. For a dedicated science undergraduate, attending lectures, mastering information by examination was simply a painful preliminary step to get into the world of creative research. Truly exciting education began when a mentoring relation was developed with a faculty member who introduced a cadre of students into their ongoing research project. Modern scientific research is team research. It's with much education taking place in an apprenticeship situation. This inculcates theories and practices of current scientific consensus into student learning, what Thomas Kuhn defined as paradigms, developing the perspectives of Kuhn's conception of what he called normal science. Education in this way prepares one for precise cutting-edge puzzle-solving research that flows from applying the paradigms of normal science. The sooner one masters the basics, the quicker one enters this world of research. But we see that the Boyer Report makes no distinction between education in the natural sciences and that in the humanistic disciplines. Furthermore, it essentially rejects a familiar 2- or 3-stage model of university education in which one first acquires a broad liberal education in the first years, upon which specialization can then be built. To the contrary, it seeks to push the graduate model down ever earlier into the university experience. This is where I think we need to gain some perspective from Newman. Newman in no way denigrates the value of specialized research. He speaks specifically of the importance of the research institute, where the highest inquiries into the sciences, in the broad German sense of that term, can take place. But the insightful remarks in the preface to the idea he made, he was aware that there are two very different ends of learning that distinguish the university in his sense and the research academy. Speaking specifically of the form of the research academy he knew in his own age, he says, "There is this sort of institution which primarily contemplates science itself and not students. The nature of the case recommends to us this division of intellectual labor between the academies and the universities. To discover and teach are distinct functions. They are also distinct gifts and are not commonly found united in the same person." The question he goes on to pose is whether, in view of this distinction, the Catholic University should not have some higher goal for its students, making them, on one hand, making a university on one hand a place where gentlemen in his sense are formed. On the other hand, it's intended to make them something or other as its great object, and not simply to protect the interests and advance the dominion of science, unquote. Now, the incursion of an educational ideal, such as we see embedded in the Boyer Report into the Catholic University, deeply undermines, in my view, the Newmanian project. In such a model, there is no real place for general liberal education, for core curricula in humanities, for reading and discussing the great works of the tradition as inquirers rather than specialized experts. It encourages development of faculty that are through and through research specialists. There's no concern to bring together branches of knowledge into an education that seeks to maintain some holistic notion of education that must be apropodoetic to specialization of research. Newman, to the contrary, suggests with something what we might call, to borrow a term from Whitehood, a rhythm of learning that leads us in stages from liberal education to specialization. In the amalgam that has developed in the American context, both in the wider university culture and with a different historical rhythm in Catholic universities and colleges, the undergraduate college and the research academy and graduate school have been combined into a single institution in many cases. This has definite benefits. I certainly wouldn't denigrate those. But I suggest that unlike the secular university, at a Catholic university we have both a duty and a theoretical reason to maintain some clearer separation of goals and intentions of the college and graduate school. If we wish to build a deeply educated Catholic community that participates broadly in world affairs and society, this seems to require something more than greater and greater research expertise. It also suggests the need for broad liberal education that drinks deeply and specifically from the Catholic intellectual tradition. This does not necessarily supply content or provide easy answers to modern problems. But Newman's ideal of a circle of knowledge suggests that we do not simply carry on education in the same way as at the secular major state research university. There must be some interpenetration of insight, some way in which we struggle to maintain a holistic education in spite of the fragmenting forces around us, some genuine commitment to the truth and to education of the whole person in a way that forms Catholic conscience and the framework on which to act. I cannot frankly see this as being accomplished by the extension of graduate education to the undergraduate level, nor can it be developed simply by a more general atmosphere of Catholic culture that has no curricular implications. I consider it imperative to emphasize the need to closely be attentive to who are the students we are actually educating. Now, the majority of students I teach, and I suspect the same is true of yours, are most likely to enter a very different world than the Boyer report seems to suggest. Most will probably be people of practical affairs, law, business, medicine, politics, journalism, diplomacy, the arts. Most will have additional specialized education in some form that is needed to take their places in these worlds. Only a small percentage will actually go on for graduate work in the humanities. I do not regret or bemoan these percentages. One generalization I can make about my students, however, is that they are likely to assume decision-making roles in their professions, whatever these happen to be. They're future CEOs, leaders of law firms, political leaders, prominent physicians, newspaper columnists, judges, and religious leaders. Some will also be academic researchers. But we must continuously ask ourselves what kind of education a Catholic university might offer those who assume such leadership roles in society. To return to my opening remarks, those who do enter medical schools or research science in the biomedical world must interface with the stunning developments in these domains that require the deepest wisdom and the broadest perspective if we are not to fashion a new world that is in truth that of Huxley's dystopian novel rather than the one I saw so gloriously and gently depicted in my experience at the University of Michigan. How are they to gain this perspective? Here, an education that makes some distinction of goals and ends of the college and graduate school seems ever more necessary. Aristotle has some surprisingly relevant things to say to us about this. In the discourse that opens the parts of animals, I should note a specialized treatise on animal anatomy, he makes the distinction of two kinds of knowledge that we can acquire. Episteme, typically translated as scientific knowledge in the English translations, and paideia, usually translated as education. Let's listen to his words on this. There are, as it seems, two ways in which a person may be competent in respect of any study or investigation, whether it be a noble one or a humble. He may either have what's rightly called scientific knowledge, or episteme, of the subject, or he may have what is roughly described as an educated person's competence, and therefore be able to judge correctly which parts of an exposition are satisfactory and which are not. That, in fact, is the sort of person we take the person of general education, or paideia, to be. As he goes on to comment, we can possess episteme for a limited field only. We can only be specialists in a few particular domains. But paideia is seeking something more, the needs of an educated citizen in a polis. As Aristotle tells us in the Politica, children are to be given paideia with an eye to the Constitution. The state is ununited and made a community by paideia. He states in the Metaphysics that one acquires through paideia knowledge of what things one should demand demonstration of, and those which one should not. Now, Newman's education, to be sure, demands more than paideia, as used in this Aristotelian sense. And the contemporary world asks for deeper and deeper epistemic knowledge from us. But as a Catholic university, it seems imperative on us to recognize the value of what we've called paideia here, alongside the demands of specialized knowledge. To urge, as we see the Boyer report do, that we engage our undergraduate students, even in the humanities, in our own specialized research as soon as possible, threatens to obliterate all claims to the value of a general liberal education that might inform the specialization of research. Newman's advice on the discourse in Christianity and medical science that he delivered to medical students in Dublin, is published in the latter part of the edition to the Idea, still seems relevant here. For there he speaks to the need, particularly for the student of the life sciences, to be cognizant of the wider range of issues that surround his subjects. Here the issues of ethics and even theology must impinge on the questions of natural science and even inform them. Where are such wider perspectives to come from, if not in the education one receives prior to entering the specialized world of research? If we do not in some way give our students some opportunity to encounter a rich liberal education in undergraduate years at a Catholic college and university, then likely they never will. It will certainly not be gained from the secular universities many of them will then enter for advanced training. Instead, they may move into increasing demands of professionalism and practical life, and many of them may find themselves, like a pilgrim at the opening of Dante's Divine Comedy, midway in life within a shadowed forest, from which there seems little way forward, and yet with few resources with which to find a way out. Thank you.
I'm going to open the floor up now for comments. I'm going to ask there are microphones here and up there. If you'd come forward, identify yourself, and address your question to one or the other panelists or to all of them together. And I'm going to ask them then to come up here and respond. Avez-vous des questions? Here we are. Is it on? I don't think so. You must be in history.
I have two questions. First would be for Professor Tillman, particularly, and the second for the whole panel. The first is, I think, unlike some of the questions I tried to deal with last night, I think it's one that is fairly straightforward that you can deal with. Confirm for me that for Newman, philosophy is not a subject that can be taught as a subject.
Here I am. This is fine. No, I don't want to do that, because one of the subjects taught in his university is philosophy in the relatively traditional sense of logic, metaphysics, and ethics. But he has different meanings for philosophy the way we do. You say, what's your philosophy of life kind of thing. He, in the idea, dithers around about what to call this habit of mind that a liberal education develops, and comes up with the word philosophy as a perfection of the intellect. But it doesn't have to be that. It could be X, as long as one understands what he means by that.
That's good enough for me. I mean, it's the method that he talks about, the comparison, the juxtaposition, the seeing how this relates to that.
That's the habit of method that, if followed through upon, will lead to the philosophical habit of mind, which you so brilliantly demonstrated last evening, an ability to see large scenes and how they interrelate and what the bearing of each part is on the other part.
Yeah, there is this kind of queasiness about the word, though, philosophy.
Fine, I know that. Yeah, just change it, Phil.
Now, the other point is, I remember reading, a number of years ago, an article by a woman named Lenore Boyle on knowledge for its own sake as the ideology of the German professorate in the 19th century. And her point was that the researcher, the German professorate, was I can't remember how it all goes, but the German professor adopted knowledge for its own sake, that is, without any kind of immediate application, but sort of pure research for its own sake, as a kind of ideology that fitted their position as paid bureaucrats. Now, that's interesting, all right, but what struck me about it was that that's the ideal of the graduate school. Research knowledge for its own sake. It's also Newman's idea. Is it or isn't it? And it seems to me that there's a kind of ambiguity there that made commitment to pure research in the graduate school capable of being justified and argued for on the Newmanian logic, which is a little strange. So I just throw that out to see what kind of reaction you might have.
I'll just make a few comments. It's always puzzling. I mean, for instance, if I just give a student Discourse 5, that's what you get. That's the whole point of education. And if you only read Discourse 5 and don't read some of the latter ones, and I think Katherine, as I can see her bringing out, that he does go on and develop that isn't enough, and so the education at this point. But I would agree, if you can proof text Newman and take that as a justification for that point, if you're simply concentrate on certain of these texts.
May I comment too? I don't think he would have any problem at all with the aim of graduate study being both the delight in knowledge for its own sake and the practical purpose of being able to earn a living and support a family. He talks in the idea about things like hunting, which can have a liberal aspect or a useful practical aspect. So, and certainly when my students are studying Newman, I tell them they better know it so they can deal with it in the oral exams at the end of seminar. I mean, so it's useful for them to learn it, as well as delighting in the beautiful prose of Newman. But it's in the rise and progress of universities where you see the value of research and the other elements that constitute the integrity of a university for Newman. All the scientific things he set up, his founding of the journal, The Atlantis, for the publication of his faculty, blah, blah, blah.
Hi, Robert Klaska from Holy Cross College across the street. A very simple question that I'd just be interested in your thoughts on. What sort of evaluation do you think Newman would make of these Catholic studies programs that have emerged? Do you think he would look at them as progress or a sort of failure?
They would not, for him, substitute for the science of theology, as he calls it. Newman distinguishes, you'll find this more in the Grammar of Assent than in the idea, between theology and religion. Theology is the intellectual or notional, the intellectual approach to its subject matter, which is one God. And in the idea, he goes on about how all the different cultures through natural religion have recognized this reality. Now, the study of other religions, I think that would be important for him, for someone who wanted to investigate that further. But I don't think, I'm sure it could not substitute for the discipline of theology for him.
This may be unfair, because I'm looking at Professor Don Brio from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, who I think might have some interesting things to share with us in the answer to the gentleman's question about Catholic studies programs. Would you do that, Don?
So you're liberally educated.
I think it's on now. Sorry. It seems to me that the question is not so much what Newman would think of approaches of Catholic studies and the relationship of Catholic studies to theology, but whether or not Catholic studies is not in some sense essential within the increasing complexity and comprehensiveness of the university of today, in contrast to his own, to demonstrate that circle of knowledge and the interdependence of the various disciplines in relation to one another for the sake of the larger Catholic intellectual unity of which he spoke so clearly. In other words, going back to that point about philosophy, how is it possible to develop within an institution, I think of my own institution now with 11,000 students of Notre Dame, but the same or slightly more, a sense of this whole? These now are so much more complex in their expression, so much more complex in the variety of audiences they serve, a very different reality from Newman's experience of university education. So it seems to me that if you're going to attempt to incarnate that in some fullness, to provide a model of what the rest of the university participates in somewhat indirectly, the way students, even in Newman's own smaller institution, participated indirectly in the whole, you have got to create some structure, some program, some new institutional reality that could clarify what that looks like. Because I think it's impossible, frankly, to renew the university on the whole in this model. There is just too much specialization of knowledge. There is too much of a diversity of audiences being served here to be able to make that translation for the university entirely. And from that point of view, I think you need an interdisciplinary program which can bring out some sense of that, in which the university as a whole might participate. That's a quick response to that problem.
So, Don, before you go.
Could I just add to that for a minute before you get back in, if you don't mind? I just want to say that, what do I want to say? Excuse me.
Just a quick follow-up. And do you think, so I understand the integrative function that the Catholic Studies program, or the vision for the Catholic Studies program is kind of a locus for the synthesis that's going on in the intellectual activity on the college. Do you think if Newman were your president, would he advocate a total overhaul of the university, or would he use the Catholic Studies program as a vehicle for integration?
Well, I think certainly the latter. I mean, one of the things that's most striking about Newman is that he's a profound realist. I mean, Newman was not in any way naive about the practical difficulties about the task of creating a university. I simply think that, and this goes back partly to what Katherine Tillman had mentioned earlier, that in the idea of a university, Newman is presenting a very abstract sort of theoretical account of a university in very generic terms. But the fact of the matter is, even as he described, I mentioned earlier, the way in which a student at a university does not have a sense of the whole except through participating in the conversations of the faculty, which gives some sense of this unified pursuit of the truth, of the unity of knowledge, of the circle of knowledge. I think Newman recognized that even within an institution as small as his own, and as difficult to manage as his own, there would be a core which would carry this forward. Others would participate in it somewhat indirectly. In our own time, I think there's no question, we have got to constitute, in some measure within our institutions, an ongoing forum program that might demonstrate what this might look like, into which people can develop some connection over time, but certainly not with the kind of intensity that some will have to carry forward. Part of my analogy here is, again, the founding religious communities that in some measure carried this on within our institutions. And in the absence of those communities, I think something new has to come in to replace it.
Thanks. Over here, please.
Hi, I'm Steve Haney from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. This discussion may have actually gathered up the question that I had. There's a line Dr. Tillman used in there where he said the Catholicism acts as the it contributes to the integrity of the university, and I'm wondering if maybe we could obviously this whole conversation begs the question, how does Newman bang up against Ex Corde Ecclesiae, which sees the university, the Catholic university, flowing from the heart of the church? It seems to me that in that vision, Catholicism doesn't act as something that contributes to the integrity of the university, but is the integrating principle of the university, much in the same way that you mentioned Bentham's utilitarian university had. This is why we made it this way. So perhaps this question can be, brought full circle by if we could address that. How does Newman and Ex Corde Ecclesiae come together? Is there any way to do that?
I've got my wits back to me again, and let me just suggest that tomorrow you go to the session, the paper of Professor Dwayne Bruce, who is speaking explicitly on Newman and Ex Corde Ecclesiae, and who is the chairman of the board of the National Newman Association in this country, not to be confused with the Newman Society, is that what it's called? In Washington, yeah. To address that question briefly, by integrity, notice that Newman means something much broader than simply an integration. I mean, he means all the things that are added to the essence of something to make it an actual living reality. Going back to that, this ideal type that he's describing in the idea of university, it really is, because the arts faculty was the first one to surface and went on, I don't know how many years before Newman added to that. Also, he says that faculty can't be aware of everything going on in the university all at one time, and that students can benefit by living among those who learn in different subject areas. But what we have to do, I gather, is, I don't think I understood what this was about until a while after I had gone through graduate school and started teaching in this interdisciplinary program. And I began to see that reading all these great books, it helps if one's got one's bearings somewhere. And that's why I think the insight that came out in Father O'Connell's piece on what was going on in Ireland and England at the time, the culture, has a lot to do with Newman's University in a way that we can't count on it today. That the Catholicism was an integrating factor in the sense of uniting and making whole in a way that, when I grew up, in a way that may not be the case today.
Well, will you join me in thanking our panelists for this wonderful